Hello, and welcome to another edition of Ask the Professor, a feature where we respond to your questions on political philosophy, history, economics, cultural trends, all those things that matter to us in our common life as citizens.
All right, here's one from Laurel. She says, is a libertarian the world's smallest political quiz that ranks people not just on the right-left axis, but on the square grid depending on how much they support economic and social or personal freedom. But in a column years ago, you suggested there should be also a third dimension indicating how devoted they are to the rule of law. How would we go about evaluating political philosophies and their adherence on the resulting Robson's cube?
Thank you for that question and for remembering that column. I like the world's smallest political quiz. I think it is more informative than the right-left axis because it does separate out questions of economic freedom from questions of social freedom. And whenever I take it, I come out as essentially libertarian, but not completely because I disagree with them on national security. I think that libertarians often underestimate the importance of having a state protect a system of personal freedom against encroachment from abroad. But these are the kind of quibbles that just move me a few points. And I encourage everybody to look the thing up and try it and think about the way in which these two different kinds of freedom interact. But what prompted the column was years ago I went to a conference on fascism at York University, and you might think they would just label everything fascist, but actually it was very interesting, informative, and thoughtful. But it got me pondering, okay, fascists tend to be people who don't much like freedom, but they're not like your run-of-the-mill socialist or modern liberal who claims to like freedom but defines it in such a way that the government has to tell you what to do. They're obviously far, far worse. I deplore the casual use of the term fascist in discussions. I'm not going to therefore sink to it myself. Fascists do tend to favor strong economic state controls. Remember, the Nazi Party was originally the National Socialist German Workers' Party, and they do tend on the whole to be somewhat socially conservative. But they're also the kind of people who break your bones if you argue with them, which is not an insignificant feature. And as I was thinking about all of this, I thought, okay, let's add a third axis here, lawful versus lawless, to separate out people who would have the state, through statute, with elections, say that certain things can't be done, and then take you to court if they thought you'd done them, and give you a chance to defend yourself, and the kind of people who would just shoot you down in the street, who would have mobs burn your house down, that sort of behavior, who would eventually create a state in which due process was deliberately an illusion or not even that. And so I thought, yeah, this does rather work, doesn't it? Because you do have, in fact, the fascist is kind of the werewolf version of a socialist, by and large. And then you also get communists, who I suppose in some ways you might say that the socialist is really, the fascist is the populist who doesn't believe in the rule of law, and then the communist, obviously, the socialist who doesn't believe in the rule of law. And you do have, and don't take this any more harshly than I mean it, you also have the anarchist, the libertarian who does not believe in the rule of law. I mean, I was once giving a speech to a group of libertarians, and I talked about the need, if you're being attacked by reductio ad Hitler, the Nazis are coming for you, you got to have conscription. And somebody in the audience said, if you did that, I would take up arms and take to the hills to fight you. And I thought, okay, that's, the community votes, they say it's an emergency, they say that we understand that conscription is a violation of individual liberty, but everything we cherish is menaced, and you would then take up arms against it. That really makes you pushes you onto the unlawful corner. You're on the libertarian line, and zoom off, you go into unlawfulness. So I think it's a very helpful way of thinking about political systems throughout the world, is to assess their attitudes toward economic and social freedom using that two-dimensional world's smallest political quiz, but then add that third dimension of unlawfulness, and then see which movements slide in that direction. Because no matter what their ostensible beliefs, they are the worst. And it's important that we be clear. There are a lot of things in this world that are undesirable, that could have very harmful tendencies, but that are not in and of themselves the werewolf version of a political philosophy. It's when you embrace lawlessness, like Mussolini was once asked, the socialists want to know your program, and he said, our program is to break their bones, and the sooner the better. That's when you slide into the pit that is at the back of that cube.
All right, let me try to defend libertarians here a little bit, because in some of the documentaries you talk about this. What if Parliament passed a law saying that all blue-eyed babies had to be killed? And that's not an example you made up. There's a famous philosopher who said that. I forget which one now, but I'm sure you'll say it. Well, then that would be the law. And it would be contrary to the law to fight that, even though it's wrong to kill babies just because they have blue eyes or for any other reason for that matter. So you got the guy who would fight you for conscription if he believed that conscription really was a terrible betrayal of our basic rights. Well, isn't he like the guys trying to defend the babies?
That's an excellent question. I think you've just asked a whole second question, but let's tackle it here and
what
now.
the heck, yes.
Because there's a distinction between rule of law and rule by law. And somebody can be very bureaucratic and orderly, and yet it's only rule by law because it doesn't respect the moral law to which human laws should aspire. I mean, one of the great problems of political philosophy, we all think that the law should be right. If we just thought that any law that existed was necessarily lawful in every sense, there'd be no basis for criticizing any law and saying, oh, it shouldn't be like that, it should be like this. You have to have some higher standard against which you measure man-made law. But there's a difference between a system that more or less gets it right, that understands that the dignity of the individual must be protected, that understands that as a general rule, force and fraud are wrong, even if they misunderstand sometimes what the meaning of that prohibition is. I mean, I think a lot of Canadian laws are unjust in that sense. But the Canadian political system is a legitimate system. People do not disappear in the middle of the night. We do not fear the midnight visit from the secret police. And yet, as you say, so suppose you live in the Soviet Union, and suppose that all of this stuff that was happening had been decreed legal. Much of it wasn't, actually, but suppose it had been. Then you would be in a situation, I think, where although the letter of man's law was being followed, as for instance in Nazi Germany with exterminating the Jews, which was on the whole lawful, although they didn't write it all down, but you were so far from what one would either call natural law or God's law, if you believe there cannot be laws without a lawmaker, that this is lawlessness disguised as law. And in that sense, it qualifies because it's not enough that you write down, today I will shoot everyone who criticizes the supreme leader.
And have Parliament ratify it, say.
Yeah, the law must actually protect those things that are inherently right. The law that St. Paul says is written on every human heart. So yes, you could have things that are formally lawful, but are nevertheless lawless. And it depends upon the gap between the positive law and natural law. And you take someone like Martin Luther King protesting segregation. That was a very interesting illustration of this because King believed rightly that segregation was an affront to man and God. But he also believed that the American political system was a legitimate system that had somehow incorporated into its rules something that was terribly illegitimate. So when he was arrested, he went to jail. He didn't break out. He didn't start a guerrilla war. He was very firm on nonviolence because he somehow sensed that there was illegitimacy inside a legitimate system. And if you could expose that contradiction, the result would be that the illegitimacy would be abolished, as indeed, by and large, it has been. But there are other systems, and again, if you lived in Nazi Germany, I think you would be justified in pretending to be loyal to Hitler while secretly working to bring about the fall of the regime. Lying would be justified. You would be justified in killing SS people, even though technically you'd be a murderer, because the whole regime is so murderous. But to conclude, it is very important that people should not get carried away by their rhetoric and start saying that we do live in a fascist state, whether they're saying this with the right or the left, because
and both of them say it. I mean,
we're
honestly.
not.
Yeah,
we are living in a state that is legitimate, that has a number of illegitimate laws that we can correct through lawful means. We live in a fundamentally lawful state in the important sense of that meaning. Whereas in China, the reverse is true. They live in a very, very legalistic, but entirely illegitimate state. And we should, in order to be sane about our problems, we must keep a sense of proportion. So take that world's smallest political quiz test, add my third dimension to it, but remember that fundamentally lawful versus lawless is not a question just of positive law, whether Parliament legislated the extermination of blue-eyed babies or of some hated ethnic group. It's whether positive law is an affront to natural law. Now, someday we should talk, if someone wants to ask about it, about this question of natural law, because it's really important to understand that there must be an eternal standard against which we measure our own efforts to make just law. Otherwise, we're measuring a bent ruler with a bent ruler, and this tells you nothing except that you are an idiot.
Right. And instead of throwing big words around like fascist or anything else like that, maybe people ought to think more about first principles.
That would be a very good start.
Especially on social media. Right.
so to speak, just to pick an example at random.
Completely at random. All right. Thanks for that, folks. If you would like to play along and ask your question of the professor, the URL on your screen will take you to a place where everything is explained. Thanks, and see you next time.